Good evening. Thank you so much, Vinicius and Mayra, for inviting us and for giving us the opportunity to participate in this exciting workshop. I'm really delighted for this fruitful exchange with you, students and colleagues. And I'm really happy for having the chance to perceive and explore this wonderful city. I'm very grateful for this. The challenge of the urban is complexity and contingency. The big question is how to interact with this. Spatial agency from the University of the Neighborhood, this is one project, to building a proposition for future activity is another project. The urban design program at Hafen City University in Hamburg is conceptually founded on an understanding of the city as not only produced in terms of its built structures, but also co-produced by the socially embedded practices of its actors and actants. These human and non-human actors come together, are assembled and interact in specific spatial settings that are conversely interwoven by diverse layers of power, such as political, economic, and material forces, decisions, practices, discourses, configurations, representations, and so on. And the transformation these cause. Agency not only refer to human actors, but speaking with Bruno Latour, also to things and matters of concern that develop agencies. The interdisciplinary approach to and focus on practices and processes departs insofar from the planning disciplines, urban planning and architecture, exploiting new areas of know-how and know-why within the realm of the social and cultural science, as we are no longer concerned with the production of buildings or physical structures alone, but with their interrelationship with those who use these structures. We realize that we are entangled with the existing, potential, and emerging assemblages rather than being in an externalized or externalizing position from which it would be possible to explain in universal terms how the city works or how to plan it. From this point of view, the city is no longer a bounded object. On the contrary, it has to be interpreted as a socio-material texture of gentle situations that is constantly in flux and never finished, always contested and rarely uniting. Methodologically, the epistemological shift from reading the city not as a closed but an open form enables us to immerse ourselves in the present so as to study historical developments of this status quo in having becomenness, to draw out possible future trajectories from this. While the notion of the urban and indeed space altogether is socially produced, is slowly but steadily gaining ground, the conditions and modes of its constantly processed reproduction and the structural and spatial vectors of its agency are given less attention. Meanwhile, collaborative, participatory, and cooperative planning processes are tested and implemented, demanded and granted. Also, of course, the nature of participation remains heavily contested and often tokenistic. Miesen even claimed participation as a nightmare. We can assume that a building cannot be reduced to form or function any longer, if that was ever possible. And even if we think that objects and thus buildings have no agency, we have to admit that they can make things happen or prevent or hinder processes. They are doing something. In what follows, this argument will serve to situate a central aspect of the research, teaching, and practice approach of the urban design program at Hafen City University with a broader perspective of the social production of the urban regarding its modes of realizing as well as its specific materialities, medialities, and temporalities. The University of the Neighborhoods can be called a long-term project that started 2007 with a students' competition and lasts till 2013 and with its post-production till today. As a project of the International Building Exhibition, many actors were involved and institutions and partner, the IBA itself, the cultural producer and provider Kampnagel, the construction company Max Hoffmann, and of course Hafen City University Hamburg. IBA made available to the project a plot with an old derelict building. According to a conventional approach, any architectural or urban design undertaking faced with this situation would probably have torn down the existing building so as to practice the core disciplinary methods of designing, planning, and building. And it's no surprise that the most participants of the previous students' competition had precisely made this proposition. Only one team, and they won the competition, worked with the existing building, you see here, but referring to Gordon Matter Clark, deconstructing in a way that it would have been more economic to build it up from scratch. Let alone, none of the proposal had produced an exciting program. The realization of all of the project in a conventional mode with professional architects and companies would have used up the whole budget for the construction costs alone. The result provoked a different approach to hinder a total failure just at the starting point of a possible project. Yet rather than tearing down the one-story building from the 50s in order to build from scratch, only to then tear down again 5 years later, the project proceeded in an archaeological manner, laying bare the various intended and unintended transformation of the building over time, from its original function as a residential home for unmarried women, to local health center for the district, to derelict graffiti canvas of the so-called crack house. Testing and trying practices of unbuilding and stripping down enabled the team of staff and students to reappropriate the building with a view to uncover and bring back to life central functions and hidden potentials of the existing structure. Reducing the building to its core and overriding it with new uses that had been deduced through emerging uses as well as negotiations served as a method to reflect on and engage with past, present, and future demands, both regarding the building, the university, and the neighborhood. The project developed to a kind of machinery, or you can call it urban laboratory, which permanently produced new questions followed up by diverse activities and forms and formats. The Hotel Question Marks was the final project with which we try to translate our research on dwelling into a spatial arrangement requesting in relation of individual to common spaces. Private spheres, that was the last one, of retreat, and here you see the temporary extension with the individual designed private rooms. New spaces emerged from the analysis of its ongoing uses of holding seminars and workshops, cooking and eating in common, inviting neighbors, undertaking research and in around the university with central questions regarding dwelling, neighborhood, urban development, and inherited functional separation were addressed both in a more traditional research projects and in actual uses in and of the building. Even the eventually moving into the building for auto-ethnographic research into dwelling as practice was an option for the students. Having agreed to hand back the empty plot as the exhibition closes down in 2013, the University of the Neighborhoods consequently followed its programmatic of reversing architecture by completely stripping bare, unbuilding, and finally tearing down the building. The next project, building a proposition for future activities, started in the year 2016 in the general context of the so-called refugee crisis in Germany and the local context of the proposed building site in Poppenbüttel, on which the Hamburg-wide program called Accommodation with Perspective Dwelling was about to be implemented. This program was thought to be a powerful tool to realize 5,600 dwelling units in areas without planning law within 1 year. The neighbors in the identified areas reacted with uproar. Not in my backyard. Too many refugees will come into our neighborhoods. This will make good integration impossible. You should understand what good integration means. In less than a week, they collected 26,000 signatures, which puts the government under enormous pressure because the question of integration could only be answered with yes or no in the now possible public petition. The government was hoaxed into a contract that determines the reduced number of 300 refugees at one place and the minimum distance to the next place of 1 kilometer minimum, which undermines the very idea of finding places for housing refugees. This action creates an ambitious situation in which self-organized citizens' engagement with the support of their lawyers determines urban policy. Professionalizing participation, they claimed their right to the city. The properties of places having found under enormous time pressure located far out in the city's outskirts, single detached family houses, a country club, a golf course, shopping mall, woodlands and fields. But conceived in true Hanseatic fashion, solid architecture wrapped up in red bricks. That's the civil society initiative Poppenbüttel Helps. Poppenbüttel is the name of this part of the city. From the direct neighborhood developed the idea to lobby for community building to be self-built, not for, but with refugees in the new residential area, and approached the research and teaching program Urban Design and the administration of the district to get involved. Convinced by the idea, we were amazed when the initiative asked for a representation of the community building meant as a photorealistic rendering, thus neglecting their own participatory approach. The intention with the image was to conceive other philanthropists to provide financial support for the project. Radically turning around the approach, we expanded its modes of showing, now ranging from process drawings to the performative setting of the summer school on site. The production of representations also focused on the possible future uses and users of the area. There were several research projects undertaken by our students to understand the actor network and their agencies concerning accommodation of refugees. The notion of accommodation as opposed to dwelling is highly problematic, as it denies any active designing of one's everyday life by reducing it to the container space where one sleeps, eats, and stores his or her things. Housing or dwelling, in contrast, is a doing. It is dwelt or inhabited as much as it built. Out of this emerged the central motive of the project: to enable refugees in and through architecture to become active in Hannah Arendt's action sense, but in a way that allowed to simultaneously overcome her hierarchical order, which Arendt has devised the thinking of agency. Mobilizing refugees' agency in this sense meant to go beyond the idea that refugees could participate in the planning or building processes and to centrally engage with their everyday lives, their backgrounds, their interests, and their resources. The project thus also problematized existing urban developments, housing policies, alliances of politics and housing industry, building codes, and in detail, one paragraph to grant building permissions without the legal basis of planning regulations for refugee accommodations only. It is just this exception that makes the distinction between dwelling and being accommodated possible in the first place. Accommodations do not provide for complementary functions such as spaces for work, leisure, or even common uses. To mobilize a multiple yet neglected or ignored agency, we reassembled the practices, approaches, and issues rehearsed during the 5-year project I showed before. It is first working with a given status quo, here in this case planned refugee accommodation, social housing residential area, then developing a motive, activating the multiple agencies of refugees, practice research coming into play as students, new neighbors, rather than refugees, industrial schools, students, residents, interested public. Developing individual motives and roles as well as needs, who will use the community building, for which function, how will this program be developed, how do we translate existing and future activities into architecture, and how can the building be realized as a self-built project. Building a proposition for future activity no longer was exclusively an architectural project, if it ever was, but instead considered the question, how do we live today, and how can accommodated refugees mobilize their agencies? To make it short, coming into play, we have organized 2 summer schools displaying how to self-build, how to collectively work out a program, how to transform it in an architectural plan, how to learn from each other and from each phase in an iterative way to develop and manage always the next step out of the situation. Creating an organizational form for the collaboration, not only to plan and build a house for encounter, but to create situations of encounter in a one-to-one scale model, to learn what this could mean to make the plan happen. Opening up the form, we make the plan performative and things public. As a result, we not only were successful in raising the required capital of 600,000 euros from a public integration fund, we also elaborated the organizational form that should enable students, industrial students, old and new neighbors, refugees, not to say refugees, to collaborate within a project office, a studio, under the supervision of an experienced architect who should not alone be experienced with the delivery of architectural services, but also should be competent in intercultural practice and pedagogy. What is seen here is the first take in preparing lunch in different groups. So one group's task was to build a kitchen, the other group should go shopping, another group cooks, the next group prepares the dining room, and the last group has to record all these activities. The next step, on the next day, we rehearsed this getting more complex. The next day was the negotiation of the program. The performative plan thus is simultaneously an emerging structure of the structuring emergence of activities that co-constitute the project community building in a one-to-one scale. Okay, you see what's going on. This diagram captures those activities, practices, and processes that have emerged during the first days of this summer school by performing the community building in a tent whose footprint corresponds exactly with the measures of the future's building ground. During the second week of the summer school, 5 inter- and transdisciplinary teams worked in the tent on the building proposition to be entered in a cooperative review process. And we have invited 5 teams, architectural teams, working together with the new neighbors and of course the old neighbors, students, industrial school students in mixed teams. And one team was Promski from Berlin, In Situ from Zurich, Atelier Bauwau from Tokyo, Assemble from London, and Construclub from Berlin. And here you see the jury meeting. The results were, of course, professionally reviewed, and please note the composition of the jury compared to the last slides. It's clearly visible how self-organization does not protect from co-optation through official agendas and interests. The opposite seems true. Okay, the result, I have to make it short. It was commissioned an architect in a quite different way than we proposed. And this is his work on the winning project you have seen just before. And this shows how and why this project was a failure in the result, but not even for us, because for us it is quite interesting to understand what was going on in this project. And for this, we are working with a project archaeology. Some final thoughts. Rethinking Vitruvi's understanding of the relation of fabrica, which meant manual work or practice, and ratiocinatio means intellectual work or theory. As a basis of the architect's knowledge production, we have to problematize anew the maintained division between constructive design action and the analytical natural science on the other hand. As a practice-based form of knowledge, we no longer can afford to cultivate the production of design mainly based on the application of tacit knowledge, means on practical experience, and the application of the scientific theoretical knowledge in a planned procedure in practice. More than this, we have to be interested in an integrative approach based on the question how the production of the urban is related to the production of knowledge, how it comes into the world, and how we can rehearse, reflect, understanding, and share these practices. May this approach seem different or even critical in relation to common design practice. I have to admit that we should avoid any kind of mystification of the critical urban design studio as a place of production of the good or better visions. We have to request critically its products and modes of reproduction in the same way as the non-critical urban design studio's outcomes and visions. Both wishes are focusing something to be realized in the near future, and for that, the responsibility is ours. Thank you.